Russia is a country at war. Hearing this sentence, your natural instinct will probably be to think of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which has escalated into the largest European conflict since World War II. But what if we told you that another war rages quietly within Russia's own borders, almost as long as the conflict with Ukraine itself? That's right, Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine, it's also fighting itself. In one corner, the entrenched elite, struggling to maintain their grip on a fractured empire. In another, a rising wave of discontent and resistance, challenging the very foundations of that empire. While this war isn't one of headlines and grand military maneuvers, it's just as consequential for the future of the Russian nation, if not more. This is the story of Russia's silent civil war. When it comes to inter-country wars, the situation is pretty clear-cut. There's usually a well-defined cause, straightforward objective, generally understood rules of engagement, and easily identifiable enemies. The battles are fought with weapons, and the outcomes are measured by territorial gains and losses, as well as direct battle deaths. In a civil war, on the other hand, all rules and boundaries are blurred. That's what makes each civil war a unique phenomenon. Still, some common elements often emerge, even amidst the chaos. In most civil wars, there's some kind of prior conflict, a simmering issue that's gradually escalated. This can be a historical grievance, as was the case with the American Civil War, long-standing political corruption like the one fueling the Syrian War, or deep social and economic inequalities that have been suppressed but never fully addressed, which led to some major bloodshed in conflicts like the Rwandan Civil War. Russia's silent civil war is unique in this regard, as the prior conflict in question is an external one, the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Russia's military engagement with Ukraine has had profound internal repercussions, creating growing divisions within the country itself. But why? Isn't the invasion of Ukraine just a special military operation aiming to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, as Russia's President Vladimir Putin put it? Of course not. As soon as Kyiv didn't immediately fall when faced with 190,000 Russian troops and tens of thousands of its vehicles, the so-called special operation became a very real war. A war that fought to strip a democratic country of its very statehood and its people of their identity. But as much as Putin tried to spout a narrative about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, calling them one people, the harsh reality was far different. So the Russian people soon started to catch on. It's not about liberation, it's about domination. And so Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 pushed forward a long-standing decline, one that has been underway for 20 years, in democratic freedoms, media autonomy, and civil society at home. In the words of Konstantin Eggert, an exiled Russian journalist, the war in Ukraine finally allowed Putin and his crowd to introduce a uniform ideology in Russia, which they always dreamt of introducing, but they couldn't do it because they were supposed to play democracy. Sure, this supposed democracy has always been somewhat of a facade, but as the Russian author Grigory Kartashvili, who goes by the pen name Boris Akunin, puts it, Russia was a troubled, chaotic democracy, an interesting country where a lot of things were happening. Now it's become totally Kafkaesque, Orwellian. And in such an autocratic regime, a civil war is almost inevitable, especially considering how poorly the Russian government treats its people. On the one hand, there are soldiers fighting in Ukraine whose role in this war can be best summed up in two words: cannon fodder. Since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as many as 592,000 Russian troops have either been killed or injured, according to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces. That's 10 times more than the total number of casualties of the Soviet Union's decade-long invasion of Afghanistan. Add the thousands of people missing or left behind in Ukraine, and it becomes clear that the human cost of Putin's brutal war is staggering. But how is this possible? Sure, the Ukrainians have been fighting fearlessly, beyond what many could have imagined. They're also supported by Western allies, with the US alone donating over $40 billion in military aid until February 29, 2024. However, the main reason Russia is suffering such heavy losses is Russia itself. Since the invasion started, the Kremlin made one reckless decision after another. First, it was the so-called partial mobilization of the Russian reservists in the fall of 2022, when 300,000 people were forced to join the army, clearly showing how bad the invasion was going only 7 months in. Vice News, a long-form news content unit with the Canadian-American media outlet Vice, visited a Russian theater-turned-draft center, processing some 100 recruits a day to gauge the reaction of those being conscripted. The conscription itself was never the problem. After all, in times of war, mobilizing additional troops is a common practice. The real issue lay in the execution and the underlying conditions that accompanied this mobilization. To start, the soldiers were only given 24 hours to report for duty, a stark contrast to the usual 3 days they previously received to say goodbye to their loved ones. In this scenario, conscripts living in a different city didn't even have a chance to kiss their parents goodbye. And even if their families managed to reach the draft center in time to say goodbye, they were only given 3 minutes to do so. 3 minutes to convey the gravity of their departure, share heartfelt words, and offer an embrace, all while fearing that it might be the last one ever. Still, many conscripts only spoke highly of their duty, either out of true blind faith or fear to speak critically of the war, which has since become a criminal offense. Alexei, a young conscript soldier interviewed by Vice, shared that he felt proud of his country and the fact he didn't shun his duty. He added he was ready to defend his motherland, not doubting for a second that it would emerge victorious. When asked whether he was willing to give his life for his motherland, his answer was affirmative, emphasizing that pride and courage are the most important things. If the Kremlin appropriately rewarded Alexei and others like him, these strong patriotic sentiments might have been sustained or even amplified. But what the Kremlin did instead was send the fresh recruits into battle with poor training, poor equipment, and worst of all, poor leadership. So video after video started emerging from the Ukrainian battlefield. New soldiers carrying rusty rifles, fresh recruits bringing their own makeshift medical kits, units sent to the front line within days of entering Ukraine despite having no formal training, commanders being drunk while their men died. Even getting badly injured in the war didn't guarantee better treatment. Most of the injured soldiers didn't receive proper therapy, and some of them were sent back to the front lines to fight. They were adding insult to literal injury. Given the horrifying reports coming from Ukraine, it shouldn't be surprising that many veterans deemed this war significantly worse than Chechnya, Georgia, or any other conflict modern Russia took part in. It also shouldn't be surprising that the war in Ukraine dealt a massive blow to the patriotism of even the most ardent supporters of the Kremlin. After all, when their country needed help, they stepped up. Yet they were only rewarded with an unrelenting cycle of disappointment and suffering. The more the abysmal treatment of the Russian soldiers became public, the worse the reactions to it got. At first, thousands of Russians fled the country to escape suffering the same fate, but then protests erupted. Military recruitment centers were set on fire. A conscription officer was even shot in Siberia. One would think that these alarming reactions would be a wake-up call for the Kremlin, but that person would be oh so terribly wrong. The Kremlin only doubled down on its repressive measures, awarding undeserving generals with medals while feeding the soldiers to the meat grinder. The government also intensified its crackdown on dissent, implemented stricter laws, and tightened control over information. In a grim display of authoritarianism, the regime pursued harsh penalties for those caught protesting in any way, squashing any trace of freedom of expression. The deepening repression underscored a regime more concerned with maintaining its grip on power than addressing the genuine grievances and dire conditions facing its people. Some 30 years ago, cases of treason were quite rare in Russia. Now anyone could be declared a traitor, be it a foreigner or a Russian citizen. In 2023 alone, there were over 100 known treason cases in Russia, reminding us of many of the infamous show trials and purges of the Stalinist era. The trials of the Putin era all shared similar characteristics. They were held behind closed doors. The specific charges and evidence supposedly secured by Russia's Federal Security Service or FSB were always shrouded in secrecy. The trials always resulted in convictions and lengthy prison terms. Many of the traitors, spies, and saboteurs, as Putin labeled the barrage of alleged enemies of the state, simply found themselves on the wrong side of an increasingly paranoid regime. And so Ivan Safronov, an advisor to the Roscosmos space agency and former military affairs journalist, was sentenced to 22 years in prison in 2022 for treason. Safronov denied these charges, insisting they were nothing but retaliation for his reporting on the military. Interestingly, his father, Ivan Ivanovich Safronov, also a journalist, died after falling from the 5th floor of his Moscow apartment building in 2007. Although his death was ruled a suicide, there were widespread suspicions that Ivan Ivanovich's death was not accidental. Many believed he was targeted for his investigative work, which often exposed sensitive military issues. The parallels between the father's mysterious death and the son's harsh sentencing were hard to ignore, leading to speculation that the Safronov family had long been under scrutiny by the state. Other notable figures who suffered a similar fate as the Safronov family include physicist Dmitry Kolka, arrested in a hospital where he was treated for advanced pancreatic cancer for supposedly revealing state secrets in his lectures in China. After being taken to Lefortovo prison, his family was told he had died in a hospital there, raising questions about the harsh treatment of terminally ill prisoners. Physicist Valery Golobkin, accused of similar charges and sentenced to 12 years, reflecting a pattern of targeting academics and scientists under the pretext of protecting state secrets. physicist Anatoly Maslov sentenced to 14 years for treason, adding to the growing fear among the scientific community in Russia as more researchers became ensnared in what many viewed as politically motivated prosecutions. Politician Vladimir Kara-Murza sentenced to 25 years in prison for giving speeches critical of Russia in the West. Luckily, Kara-Murza was released on August 1, 2024, as part of the most extensive prisoner exchange between the US and Russia since the end of the Cold War. The Wall Street Journal's Evan Gershkovich, sentenced to 16 years in prison on espionage charges. He was also one of 26 political prisoners released in the August 1 exchange. As a result of these horrifying persecutions, powerful voices standing up against Putin and his ruling elite are becoming a rarity. And who can blame them when speaking up can only get you in one of these three places: in prison, in exile, or 6 feet under? However, prominent Russian and foreign figures aren't the only ones Russia is waging a silent civil war against. The most horrific stories are coming from all corners of the country, where ordinary citizens are finding themselves ensnared in the Kremlin's web of repression. Sometimes for something as simple as holding a sign calling for peace, repeating a chant, and even reciting a poem. That's right, Artem Kamardin, a 33-year-old Russian amateur poet, was jailed and given a 7-year sentence for reciting a poem. But this was not before he was brutally beaten by Russian police, stripped naked, and ordered to ask for forgiveness on video, and even sexually assaulted with a metal bar. His fiancée, who was present for the brutal raid and later interviewed by Vice, was also threatened with sexual violence, with the Russian forces trying to glue her lips together to silence her screams. Similar horror stories have emerged from across the country, painting a chilling picture of the Russian state's systematic crackdown on dissent. These accounts reveal a regime that has abandoned any pretense of justice or humanity, instead resorting to sheer brutality to maintain control. According to an independent media and human rights defense group focused on Russia, OVD Info, over 260 people are currently serving jail terms for crimes related to taking an anti-war stance. This number is just a small fraction of the staggering 20,040 people who've been detained for the same reason since February 24, 2022. There have also been 622 cases of extrajudicial pressure for an anti-war stance, as well as 1,206 cases of pressure on media workers and journalists. Another figure of note is the 45 repressive laws introduced since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. Most of these laws, 26 of them, deal with the so-called foreign cooperation and foreign agents. 10 of them target freedom of speech and expression, and 5 aim to regulate the internet. In some cases, sentences for the crimes committed under these laws are equal to those passed down for murder. As for the potential defendants under these laws, the list grows longer by the day, and virtually anyone can make the list. As OVD Info lawyer and analyst Daria Korolenko puts it, they will imprison old people, they will imprison people who have disabilities, they will imprison people with children and women with children. They just want everyone to be silent. So Evgenia Mayboroda, a 72-year-old woman from Russia's Rostov region, was jailed for 5.5 years in early 2023 for spreading false information about the Russian army on social media. The false information in question, an emotional video about the number of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine. All things considered, it shouldn't be surprising that one of the prominent individuals jailed for his words, Oleg Orlov, described Russia as sinking deeper and deeper into this darkness at an ever-quickening pace. And in this darkness, there's no room for accurate media reporting or democratic institutions, so the Kremlin has been on a mission to dismantle both, sending more clear messages that a Russian civil war is underway. As far as media goes, a severely damaged information space is nothing new for Russia. Every special operation, conducted by the state, Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, has been accompanied by a purge of the media space. However, this de facto military censorship has reached new heights after the invasion of Ukraine. The goal is clear: to irreversibly break the flow of independent information and ensure that only the Kremlin's narrative prevails. As a result, a new, alternate reality has been created by the Kremlin, one where the Kremlin is supported by the majority of people, where Russia is the liberator and Ukraine is the oppressor. The Ukrainian people are vile, fascist Nazis, committing genocide against the Russian people. Even Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president and a Jewish person, is a Nazi. These messages are plastered all over, on state-run TV channels, news bulletins, and nationwide billboards. As Korolenko puts it, the climate is fed by the mainstream media that everyone is a spy and a traitor, foreign agent. Everyone wants to destroy Russia, destroy your home. Besides utilizing the Russian people against the common enemy, these campaigns are also trying to persuade them to join the army voluntarily, often playing on male fragility. Do you want to be a hero, a true patriot, or a spineless coward? But you see, these tried-and-true methods of manipulation and propaganda aren't as effective today as they were in the Soviet era. Why? 2 words: the internet. Russia's youth, more connected than ever through social media and alternative news sources, are increasingly exposed to diverse perspectives and information. Unlike the Soviet era, when state-controlled media was the sole source of news, today's digital age allows for rapid dissemination of uncensored information and alternative viewpoints. So what does the Kremlin do? It focuses on the internet specifically, of course. The Kremlin is heavily investing in the Institute for Internet Development, or IID, whose goal is to essentially funnel nationalistic online content. In 2022, this organization received $163 million from the Russian state. In 2023, this figure rose to $217 million, while in 2024, it's expected to reach $282 million. All the online shows produced by the IRI are designed to reinforce the Kremlin's narrative and suppress dissenting views. These productions are aimed at saturating the digital landscape with state-approved content, trying to counteract the influence of independent and foreign media, which are desperately trying to show the Russian people the true cost of the war. Besides the internet, the only way people can find out what's truly happening in this information vacuum is through a series of somewhat unreliable Russian Telegram accounts. But many people don't need any official or unofficial sources of information to understand what's truly happening in their country. All they need to see is the increasing number of graves across the country, with families not even allowed to open coffins of their loved ones before burying them. Signs of unjust suffering are visible across Russia, so it's only a matter of time before the current silent civil war turns into a fully-fledged uprising. This possibility is only further supported by the pace at which Russian people are losing trust in the legitimacy of government institutions and the rule of law in Russia. The 2024 Russian presidential elections are the perfect example of this. After 3 days of voting, Putin reportedly won over 88% of the vote, getting re-elected as president for an unprecedented 5th time. In another drastic step away from democracy, Putin made amendments to the Russian constitution in 2020 to allow him to remain in power, potentially until 2036, when he would be 84 years old. Although Putin's victory was a foregone conclusion before the first ballot was even cast, the sheer scale of electoral fraud and manipulation was still astounding. Ballot stuffing, voter intimidation, busing Putin supporters to vote multiple times at different locations, forcing people to vote at gunpoint. There was nothing subtle about the efforts to skew the results in Putin's favor. Of course, there were still protests against the inevitable outcome. Thousands of Russians agreed to vote at noon on Sunday, thus symbolically supporting the late pro-democracy activist Alexei Navalny, who endorsed the Noon Against Putin plan on social media before he died. Others showed their discontent by spoiling their ballots and writing Navalny's name on them. Speaking of Navalny, many believed his death to be the conclusive phase of the country's regression toward authoritarian rule. Once Navalny, Putin's most prominent critic, was killed in February 2024, there was no going back. As Akunin explains it, by killing Alexei Navalny, they lost the last chance of trying to pretend that they were decent, law-abiding. Violence has now become the central pillar of the Russian state, and no matter how the war in Ukraine ends, the trajectory of the Kremlin's authoritarian regime seems unalterable. As long as the Kremlin is fighting its own people, violence won't dissipate from Russia. With this in mind, a question instantly arises. Will this silent civil war grow into an all-out uprising? Quite possibly. Although the country's regime's brutal tactics are aimed at preventing this, they might just push the ordinary Russian people over the edge, thus having the opposite effect. After all, Russia was already on the brink of a fully-fledged civil war in June of 2023. This is when the infamous Wagner Group rebellion took place, checking all the boxes for an impending civil war. A fragmentation of security forces, loyalty shifts, the rise of armed groups' activity, escalating civil unrest. Prior to the rebellion, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, a private military company whose fighters have taken part in brutal conflicts all over Africa and the Middle East, openly and publicly criticized the Russian leadership for their poor handling of the invasion and inadequate support for the troops. He reported news straight from the front lines, earning international recognition. While Prigozhin's true motives can be debated, one thing was for certain: he showed the true state of the Russian military and its leadership. He labeled the Russian parliament members as useless, saying they should be the ones to go to the front first. Prigozhin didn't mince his words when talking about the commanders of the Russian army too, proclaiming they should be sent to the front barefoot with just a submachine gun. He particularly taunted Russia's former Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, calling him lazy and blaming him for the unnecessary full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. According to Prigozhin, the invasion of Ukraine was launched because Shoigu and his oligarch friends became greedy for more Ukrainian territories, causing them to push the Russian military into a pointless war that took hundreds of thousands of their lives. Prigozhin's message was clear. The evil brought by the military leadership of the country must be stopped. So he set out to do just that. Insults and call-outs turned into a full-blown rebellion in June 2023, when Prigozhin and 25,000 of his Wagner Group forces launched an unprecedented armed insurrection against the Kremlin. They started by seizing Rostov-on-Don, a Russian city a couple of miles from the Ukrainian border. Prigozhin posted a video of himself in the courtyard of the Southern Military District headquarters in the city, dispelling any doubts about his intentions. Interestingly, even on the eve of this insurrection, Putin reportedly didn't believe that it would ever actually happen, showing just how disconnected he'd become from the internal dissent brewing within his ranks. His disbelief underscored a dangerous complacency, allowing the rebellion to gain momentum and catch the Kremlin off guard. The Wagner Group rebellion was characterized by a rapid and audacious march toward Moscow, Russia's capital, seizing some military and administrative installations along the way. The armored columns bound for Moscow consisted of 5,000 to 8,000 combatants with tanks, armored vehicles, anti-aircraft weaponry, and civilian trucks. According to reports, the closest the Wagner Group got to Moscow was some 59 miles south of the city, reaching the town of Kashira. However, the only visual confirmation places Prigozhin's troops in Krasnoye in northern Lipetsk Oblast, 210 miles south of Moscow. Regardless of how far the Wagner Group got, it was clear that the sudden rebellion severely rattled the Kremlin and exposed significant vulnerabilities within the Russian state. The Wagner Group's advance, even if it didn't quite reach Moscow, demonstrated the capacity for serious internal dissent and the potential for rapid and destabilizing action in war-torn Russia. After almost 2 full days of advances, Prigozhin accepted a deal with Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko to prevent bloodshed. The deal was for the Wagner Group to cease any advancement and return to the base in exchange for a guarantee of its safety. If you're wondering why Lukashenko was the one to broker the deal, it's because Putin refused to speak to Prigozhin, who he once saw as a powerful ally. Putin previously denounced Prigozhin, though not by name, stating, "Exorbitant ambitions and personal interests have led to treason." And by now you know how Putin responds to treason at the highest level. Exactly 2 months after the Wagner Group rebellion, Prigozhin's airplane en route from Moscow to St. Petersburg crashed, killing all 10 people inside, including Prigozhin and several senior Wagner members. Though there were some claims that the aircraft was shot down by Russian air defenses over Tver Oblast, Western intelligence believed that an explosion on board was the culprit. Either way, the man who so publicly defied Putin and challenged the Kremlin's authority was no more. In the year since, the Kremlin has effectively dismantled the Wagner Group, placing the ex-Wagner troops across the Russian state. The goal was to eliminate a single person in charge, thus neutralizing any potential resurgence of organized resistance. Although some observers believed the Wagner Group would be eliminated, this was never going to happen. For one, Russia can't afford to lose any more soldiers, especially those as well trained and experienced as the Wagner troops. According to the US National Security Council, as many as 50,000 Wagner mercenaries were fighting in Ukraine at one point, underscoring just how crucial they are for the war effort. But also, the Wagner Group has historically been incredibly important for the Russian state, both geopolitically and economically, making it an invaluable asset beyond the war in Ukraine. With the dismantling of the Wagner Group, it's safe to say that no potential Putin adversary is strong enough to consolidate power and challenge his grip on the Kremlin, for now at least. Given how fast Russia is fracturing into power blocks and how seemingly willing the Kremlin is to target its own people, the situation in Russia remains volatile, and that's the understatement of the century. But what do you think? Is Russia inevitably heading for a full-scale civil war once its citizens finally reach a breaking point and rise against the regime's oppressive tactics? Or will the Kremlin's heavy-handed control and strategic dispersal of dissenters prevent such a scenario from unfolding? Share your theories in the comment section below. Now go and check out how Ukraine's invasion turned Russian civilians against Putin, or click this other video instead.